This AKPIA lecture. My name is Rifky, and together with Manar Moursi, we'll be moderating today's event. Manar and I are working hard on our PhDs as part of AKPIA and HGC. I want to preface my introduction with a statement. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. Now, I'd like to say a few words on the nature of the event this evening, and then I'll introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Mohamed Elshahed. Following the lecture, Dr. Nassar, Aga Khan Professor and Director of AKPIA, will say a few words, and Manar Moursi will be moderating the discussion. Ahead and during the discussion, we'll be taking your comments and your questions on the webcast page. And now I'm delighted to introduce Mohamed Elshahed, who's a curator and architectural historian focusing on modernism in Egypt and the Arab world. He's the author of Cairo Since 1900, an architectural guide published by AUC Press last year, the first substantive survey of modern architecture in Egypt's capital spanning 226 sites. He holds a master's from MIT AKPIA and a PhD from NYU's Department of Middle Eastern Studies. His work spans architecture, design, and material culture. He's the curator of the British Museum's Modern Egypt Project and Egypt's winning pavilion, Modernist Indignation, at the 2018 London Design Biennale. In 2019, Apollo magazine named him among the 40 under 40 influential thinkers and artists in the Middle East. In 2011, he co-founded Cairobserver to stimulate public debates around issues of architecture, heritage, and urbanism in the region. In spring 2020, he was the Practitioner-in-Residence at the NYU Kevorkian Center in New York. And for full disclosure, I should say that Manar, Mohamed, and I share many Cairo lives, present and past, and hopefully also future. And so I'm particularly excited for this evening's event and for having him with us. And Mohamed, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Manar, Sarah, and thank you, Manar, and for being part of this event today. And also thanks to Nassar for inviting me. I'm very grateful to be back at MIT with this project. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And so, yeah, just finish a few thanks. Thanks to Nassar, thanks to Jose for helping with all the organizational aspects of today's event, Sarah and Manar. And at AUC Press, I have to thank my editor, Nadia Narkrib, for everything she's been doing with me on this book. Also, I have to thank Hala Higazi, who's an architect who was leading the research team that made this book happen. The team was up to 20 individuals at some point, and I think without Hala, this book wouldn't have come together. What I want to do today is slightly different from what I would have usually done. I want to actually start with maybe a bit of some polemical ideas, let's say. And so I'll get started right away. The American humanities, and particularly architectural history, seem to be insulated from the wider cultural and political events taking place around us, keeping low while the storm passes, so to speak. So rather than give a straight book talk, I gave one yesterday, actually, hosted by NJIT, my undergraduate school of architecture. I thought today I would leave my comfort zone a bit and just share a few polemics and ideas that I think have shaped me and out of which this book has come. And before I get into serious business, I just want to say that my publisher has been so kind to offer a discount if you purchase directly from the publisher's website, which is now going to be shared in the discussion dialogue. So some of the ideas I will be sharing today actually were fleshed out in 3 texts that I've published in the year since the book has come out last March. The book unfortunately came out exactly 2 weeks before the first lockdown. And so in that meantime, some new material was written, and I think it's important to mention some of those ideas today. And those publications in particular are, just in case anybody would like to reference them, are Udo Kulterman's History of Arab and Contemporary Architecture. That's my chapter in a book co-edited by Roberto Fabri and Sultan Saud al-Qasimi, which is coming out by Routledge this summer. The other piece that I will sort of reflect on some of the ideas in that in today's talk was published in Platform Space last September on the question of architectural history and its relationship to demolition. And the third text, some of which I'll be referring to here today, is an afterword I wrote for the Keeping It Modern book that's edited by Aziza Shoni as part of the Getty Foundation's Keeping It Modern project. So, first part. I was in Cairo in 2011 when protests erupted, calling for the overthrow of the failed political and economic system that governed when protesters called for the end of the current regime, essentially. It was then that Omar Suleiman, former head of Egyptian intelligence, made the infamous statement that, quote, Egyptians are not ready for democracy, unquote. It was a statement largely aimed at Western observers. The underlying logic of Suleiman's statement rests on European Enlightenment thinking, namely the Hegelian notion that while all men are created equal, not all humans have yet achieved full personhood to become men. It is a notion that lives with us until today, and even more relevant to our discussion, it remains at the base of architectural history as a discipline. For example, when modernist expressions outside the geographies of the West are dismissed as inauthentic or mere replicas of Western originals, this continues to happen in conferences until this day. What we politely call Euro or Western centrism in architectural history is in fact white supremacy. Most critiques of Eurocentrism of the architectural survey will likely begin with Fletcher's tree of architecture. And throughout the presentation, I'll be referring to some maybe unusual sources, but I think one of the sort of things that we should try to do within architectural history is to move outside of our comfort zones. For example, social media is really an incredible platform for some really interesting critique that's made much more widely accessible to a mass public, hundreds of thousands of people sometimes, than a public that any architectural historian would really be able to access. Yet, for example, sort of these Hegelian ideas that I just mentioned are still mentioned in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as central to architectural history, with with zero reference to the racist sort of character of some of these thinkers and their place in sort of the history of colonialism and worse. The early generation of architectural historians, such as British-German art historian Nicholas Biesner, collaborated with leading American and European architects to forge a movement with its pioneers, their theories, and their masterworks. By 1940, modern architecture was fully assimilated into the art historical canon and given its place in the history of the styles. This canon was provincial in its conception, considering works and architects operating within limited geographies, yet its claims were universal. The caveat of such an intellectual project is that it uncritically universalizes European and North American experiences and assumes their superiority. And I think if we look back at, again, Bannister Fletcher's tree of architecture can only be understood within the wider historical context of the invented racial theories following the discovery of the Americas and the age of imperialism that followed. It is within this backdrop of politically and economically harnessed othering that the inventory of selected works accumulated by generations of West-based historians were elevated as iconic formal expressions of the modern, against which all other architectural production taking place outside the purview of these architects and their historian colleagues would automatically be dismissed. And critiques of the architectural canon were pioneered not by white men who traveled the world in search of new territories that they can include in their canons or to be expert on, but mostly actually, or most notably by Turkish women who immigrated to the United States, such as Zeynep Çelik, Sibel Bozdogan, Gülsüm Baydar Nalban Turlu, and Esra Khan. They decried the standard survey for its hierarchies, its fixed styles and language, its Western centrism, and its focus on white male architects. While the tree of architecture no longer appears in textbooks, the ideas that give structure to it are still visible in many of the most widely read architectural survey textbooks today, including the one I studied as an undergraduate. In architecture, William Curtis's Architecture Since 1900. And when I was preparing the lecture, I actually realized that subconsciously the title basically shaped my title. In a way, my book, Cairo Since 1900, is a way of responding to Curtis. So as a counter approach, I think the city, I think the sharing paused. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened. Words of expertise, power, and capital, including local interlocutors. The Industrial Revolution was not possible without the expansion of European colonial projects that exploited geographies far outside Europe. Modernist architecture did not develop in a hermetically sealed Europe, but in an interconnected and networked world where the peripheries of empire were often laboratories for innovation and experimentation with long forgotten partners. And I think it's really important to mention here, just to go back to some of the key quotes from Curtis. So what I was showing just before were just some images of Alexandria, the city where I was born, that was very much shaped by modernist architecture. In fact, this is why I wanted to study architecture. And then I arrive at architecture school and my textbook tells me, things like this by Curtis. I just want to also quickly show you one of the buildings that, left a particular mark on my childhood and my interest in architecture. And there was no way to really understand within an architecture school in North America how to read this building historically and how to engage with it. And this is the state of the building today. And I think what I'm trying to suggest here is actually the fact that we don't have the tools to know how to read these sites through, what's being taught in university today. Going back to some of these sites, some of them don't even wait for us. They're either demolished or completely mutated. And so it really has a kind of a domino effect on how modern architecture can be read across vast geographies. The geographies from which many of the international students that arrive at schools in the US come from. So central to the story of global modernism is travel. And I think what I just suggested with picking at Curtis with his idea of the relationship of the West to the non-West, somehow the idea of exploration and traveling beyond the geographies of the West is read very differently than if people from those geographies move to the West. And, and I mentioned this because, from the 1960s, historians and critics based in Europe and the US were itching to be the first to conquer new frontiers of knowledge, at least for English speakers. As an example, during his long career, historian Udo Kulterman published 35 books in German and English in an astonishingly wide variety of subjects, including new Japanese architecture, new directions in African architecture, 69, the Japanese architectures in 1960, contemporary architecture in Eastern Europe, 85, and contemporary architecture in the Arab states, 1999. It appears that for Kulterman and others like him, moving beyond the West meant becoming an expert on everything else. I don't think anybody today can get away with this, certainly not a person of color. And of course, as an expert, he traveled widely and was welcomed by the elites and the respective countries that he traveled to as sort of a foreign expert. Again, a position that's very much possible in the basis of sort of a white supremacist culture. This is his book on the Arab states that I wrote my chapter on. By the 1980s and 90s, when Kulturman was conceptualizing how to narrate the various contemporary architectural developments across the post-oil crisis Arab world, which was gripped by Western-backed dictatorships, which of course he does not mention, on the one hand, Kulturman's book as a response to a gap in knowledge. Very little of the architectural practice taking place in these geographies was talked about in Europe and North America. On the other hand, like his predecessors, architectural historians before him, he provides a partial narrative historically justifying specific contemporary practices he admires or admired. In the absence of other narratives, his stands unchallenged. Just want to check the time. And again, just kind of pulling from some of what, people are talking about these days. It's hard to be looking at a figure like Kulturman without paying attention to what the notion of exploration in the 20th century could possibly mean. So what I'm actually going to do, oh yeah, I have one more point on travel. What Kulturman sort of got away with in the 1970s and 80s is not really foreign to many historians today. The notion of travel is still very central to the way art historians in North America speak about what needs to be done to sort of complicate the narrative and to complicate the architectural survey. But I find this really troubling in an age when thousands sink to the bottom of the Mediterranean in their attempt to cross the sea, when the populations of entire nations are trapped indefinitely within their borders by Western-friendly autocratic regimes who rule them, or by the humiliating visa processes, or simply by the sheer cost of travel. These people are unable to travel today. When entire countries are placed on travel bans, architectural historians speak about travel with ease, quite lightly actually. For an American or European architect or historian, travel can potentially allow them to write global histories of architecture or to have new frontiers and clients for their practice. However, the travel or displacement of a person of color is often weaponized as an explanation for the inauthenticity of their work. When I present my work about modernists in Europe and in the US, I'm often sort of asked immediately, where was he studying and has he traveled? As if him traveling, or her, hopefully in some cases, is kind of a way to sort of, that question is pregnant with kind of a very racist notion and what the idea of travel can do to someone, because it's not read in the same way if it's a white person traveling. And as a displaced immigrant myself, this perspective poses an existential threat. So on the note of travel, I want to actually take you through kind of a series of anecdotes arranged chronologically, mostly following the life of one particular architect, Sayed Karim, which I hope will point some of the issues and challenges we collectively face in writing a more nuanced history of global modernism. And I think some of these ideas also shaped my particular work. So 1933, Sayed Karim, a fresh graduate from Cairo University, School of Architecture, arrives in Zurich to join ETH for graduate studies. He is received suspiciously. They are not sure what really to make of him. And when I went to ETH and looked at the archive, some of his paper trail still remains today. And I was able to see that he actually spent the full year paying, but not having any of his classes counted towards his degree. Essentially, he had to prove for a full year that he's competent to be a recognized student of the institution. This is, of course, 1933, when pretty sinister things were taking place just next door to Switzerland. He managed, and he went on to not only complete his master's, but also to become the first Arab architect with a PhD in 1938. In 1938, he actually attends a conference in Brno, Czechoslovakia, and there he presented the recent work of architects in Cairo using slides, but he had no magazine to sort of show, to prove that these buildings exist in Egypt. And he writes about this in his own magazine, which he established in 1939, Al-Amara, as a response to this incident when he felt that he needed to prove that modernity does exist, or modern architecture does exist. Of course, the terminologies used are my own in this particular case. He simply is talking about architecture of his time. And so the magazine actually runs for about 20 years with 67 issues, interrupted for some time here and there, for example, during World War II. But I think it's really important to understand this particular incident that triggered the establishment of the magazine. In 1945, Karim and others in the profession, once World War II ended, launched sort of the first Arab engineering conference, which was held in Alexandria that year. In 1946, a bigger conference was held in Cairo, and in 1947, yet a bigger conference was held in Damascus. There was a kind of an excitement that now that the war has ended and that British troops have left, that Arab engineers and architects can play a bigger role in development, become really the experts that these nations, which Curtis would call stagnating, but of course they are stagnating because of colonialism, that they thought that they can play a bigger role in sort of resolving that situation. In 1952, on January 25th, which is now an infamous, famous day for other reasons, the revolution of 2011, British soldiers killed a dozen policemen in a siege in the city of Ismailia, and the following day a riot broke out in Cairo, and fire was set ablaze to dozens of buildings actually in the downtown area. And this is relevant for the story because Sayed Karim's offices were affected by the fire. He lost his entire archive and the archive of the magazine that he had just established in 1939. So this poses immediately a question for us if this is one of the central figures of what could have been called a movement, if the same kind of trend was parallel, but we can discuss about the notion of a movement. But a central figure to modern architecture in Egypt lost his entire archive in this incident. What does that mean for research and for the writing of architecture history? Throughout the 1950s, despite that incident, Sayed Karim was able to present himself as an expert regionally and to travel to several Arab countries and actually design dozens of both urban and architectural projects, from private and small to large and state-funded. These are some images from Jeddah in the 1950s, and I can actually recognize a few Sayed Karim buildings, such as this one. What's really interesting is it really doesn't take long for that stint, that part of his career to end, because of course a new set of experts arrived, American mostly, and some European, German, and people like him had to sort of be pushed aside. 1957, Frank Lloyd Wright, on his way back to the United States from Iraq, stops by Cairo at an invitation by the Society of Egyptian Architects. And in Egypt, unlike many post-colonial and recently independent states, it was homegrown architects at that time who were really developing the architectural landscape. And following a brief tour that they gave to Frank Lloyd Wright around the city, he made some remarks at a reception in which he openly criticized those architects for their work. We have to remember that Frank Lloyd Wright was designing kind of an Alibaba fantasy with the Opera House in Baghdad, with the Harun al-Rashid sort of statue and so on. So of course for him, it's a shocker to see the type of architecture that was mainstream in Cairo at the time, which for the lack of better terminology, I guess would be called the international style, although that's one of the issues I'd like to raise, that do we have to call it that? But it's certainly not the architecture that Frank Lloyd Wright was himself championing. And here I'm putting just a couple of quotes of what he said. For example, it saddened him to see the work of Egyptian architects, and he invokes the notion of civilization, and he calls this cheap and pedestrian architecture, apparently that he hadn't seen anything like except in Johannesburg. This was, of course, perfectly okay to say. In 1965, after providing plans for entire cities and a plethora of state-built projects in Egypt, Sayed Karim, who was known to be stubborn, fell out of political favor, probably because he wanted to do things his way. And you can see down at the bottom just one of his many state projects, a culture palace Minister of Culture. And the main image you're looking at on the screen is his own house, which was completed in 1948 in the suburb of Maadi. So in 1965, is actually when he falls out of political favor, he's placed under house arrest, his offices are shut, his archive is again confiscated. So thus, despite all of his ambition, Sayed Karim is not a modernist hero. And I'm sort of reminded always of how I learned about, the pioneers as sort of in these heroic terms. Only later on through people like Jonathan Meades do we hear about, Le Corbusier's kind of problematic political stance, for example, or Frank Lloyd Wright's troubled personal life. But the way we learn about these figures is very different. Yet, someone like Sayed Karim, the tragedy is really what we know, if anybody knows anything about him, because his work has been really lost. So since the free officers proclaimed independence in 1952, there has been no methodological approach to writing local histories of the built environment in all epochs and architectural manifestations, including the contemporary, the vernacular, and the anonymous. The perpetual present has been rendered ahistorical. And the reason this is perhaps interesting is maybe to shift to some issues related to the architectural survey and how it could manifest in a place like Egypt. So before I shift to that, I just want to show from one particular moment in the beginning of the 20th century, the plethora of architectural styles that manifested, and maybe the difficulty of why using the terminology and the stylistic sort of modes that we understand based on other examples to really understand what these buildings are. This is, for example, the Egyptian Museum, completed in 1902, out of a competition that was done in 1897. And it's the first purpose-built museum up until that point in that part of the world. And you can see it's kind of a Beaux-Arty, neoclassical building with some ancient Egyptian references in a European style, I would say, as decorative features. And not that long away from the completion of that building, we have two examples here. On the left is a beer brewery, which is kind of a very robust Tuscan maybe style, we can call it, or Tuscan influenced, looks like a castle of sorts. But it's also interesting for us because it's the first use of reinforced concrete in the city, and this is done roughly around the same time, completed in 1900, 1901. And then to the right is a palace by one of the princes of sort of aristocracy, and it's completely eclectic building, for the lack of a better word, and it's again based on his own travels across North Africa and other parts of the Muslim world. And it took him quite some time. It was kind of made progressively over more than a decade, really. And these are all really happening roughly around the same time. 1903, we got this example completed for the National Library and the Museum of Arab Art at the time, and then now it's the Islamic Art Museum. And you can see kind of this mixture, supposedly, I would say maybe between sort of a kind of a Renaissance structure to the facade with Islamic elements of sorts. The synagogue, the main synagogue of the city, completed in 1905, kind of invents its own iconography with the use of this sort of palm tree motif, which is recurrent across sort of other synagogues from the same period across the city. And we have one more example, roughly from the same decade, which is the Baron Palace by Belgian businessmen settled in Egypt. And it's in this sort of neo-Hindu style, but of course, really has a kind of a Beaux-Arty plan as well. So all of this is happening in one city within the span of a decade, sometimes within the span of a few years. And I think this is part of the reason why, it might be quite difficult for us to use the conventional terms to sort of project on these sites and to understand them in this way. I would say that this kind of heterogeneity had been, for a very long time, the main reason why this architecture has been sort of dismissed the word hybrid used to come up a lot in some decades ago with some studies. But I think obviously this was again kind of an attempt to say, well, hybrid needs to be hybrid of two things or multiple things. And so divide again stylistically these buildings into parts and then try to understand them in that way. I don't think this is necessarily how many of them were actually designed. So I just show here the image of Maxer's Pacha. I had something written down, but I'll just sort of say it without reading it. Actually, I have it written here, so I'll just go for this. So architectural history has been fundamental to the development of the architectural profession since the 19th century. In some places, the formalization of architectural education in the United States in various European contexts centered on the study of historical examples, spawning a new era of revival architecture throughout the late 19th century and the early 20th century. As Stanford Anderson noted, quote, from the time of the dominance of academic classicism around 1800 through all the historicisms and eclecticisms of the 19th century, history was in some way intimately wedded to the practice and teaching of architecture, end quote. This may be true for those contexts, but the relationship between architectural education practice and history in the modern Arab states is vastly different and varies from one national context to another. The region's first systematic identification, listing, and documentation of buildings commenced in 1881 in Egypt with the establishment of the Comité. And it was a task that combined architectural history writing with upkeep and restoration, and that also produced a wide array of accurate documentation of historic details. That also spawned of historic buildings that spawned also a wave of revival architecture at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. So yes, for a certain moment, history writing, heritage identification and protection, and contemporary practice were intimately wedded, as in the case of Max Pasha, because he, for example, he did all three. The Comité led by Herz made parts of Egypt's urban landscape legible by codifying styles, creating genealogies of buildings, and establishing a canon of Arab monuments. But of course, there's kind of that link with a European project that's taking place, a version of it is taking place in a place like Egypt, and it's very short-lived. Much of the methods, such methods, were not extended to more recent constructions. In the meantime, architectural education was tied to schools of engineering, originally established by the army in the 1830s, where the history of architecture was not intimately wedded to practice and teaching. During colonial rule from 1882, well, formally at least 1882 to 1952, architectural education shifted towards a Beaux-Arts model led by mostly British faculty until the 1940s. The emergence of a new class of Egyptian architects was not accompanied by the emergence of specialized art historians chronicling the production of the present and recent past. And yeah, so I'll skip over some of these points here and just kind of jump right into the book. I think this is just some context of some of the ideas that I've been thinking about in relation to making the book. And what I'll try to do for, I believe I have another 20 minutes or so, or less than that, is to run through a sampling of the book just to give you a taste of A, some of the main ideas, and B, some of the specimens in it. I would say one of the important points that might be controversial for some is to actually say that Cairo is essentially a 20th century city. If you look at the pink outline area on this map of 1912, the larger area is the entire city at that time, and then the smaller area is the historic ancient city. And that entire area is right there smack in the middle of this map, which is more or less the city today. And so everything that's outside of this pink area developed after World War I. And so it's important to understand that context, that there's quite a lot that actually makes Cairo kind of a 20th century city. In the beginning of the 20th century, there's kind of a variety of approaches, like I mentioned just moments ago. And then in 1919, a revolution kicks off that sort of awakens the national ethos and a search for sort of identity in some cases, but also in others, kind of an interest in the modern, as seen, for example, in the press of the time. This is a magazine not for architects, not by architects. It's aimed at a general audience, yet it's very clear here. It's from 1939. The magazine actually goes back to the late 1920s. And the idea of the modern house is very present as sort of a materialization of new notions of modernity and national identity. Another point that comes across in the book is that that the city's architectural culture has always been porous, which is, as I've mentioned, and through some of these anecdotes, for example, Mercer's Fascia and others, this is a place, literally the capital city at the intersection of Europe, Africa, and Asia. So to use models for analysis that we use, the conventions, let's say, that are coming out of European contexts to understand what's going on in a place where so many influences and interests and circulation of people are intersecting is really not sufficient. And so, yeah, the School of Architecture, for example, has quite an interesting history, but I won't get into it right now. This is a class photo from 1927. Another point is that Cairo provided a rich ecosystem for a sophisticated architectural culture to develop. Like I mentioned earlier, the conferences that took place, the exhibitions that took place, not necessarily looking at the design of buildings, but sometimes materials. This is an exhibition focused on concrete and its uses. In the background, you see an industrial complex designed by Mahmoud Riyad. And architects also played occupied a vibrant place in mainstream culture by writing in magazines that are, again, not aimed at other architects, but at general readership to highlight issues such as housing and urban challenges, particularly in the period right after World War II, as I mentioned, as part of the sort of the move to create these conferences. A lot of this kind of evaporates when authoritarianism settles in the 1950s. And there's quite a rich publishing culture as well. This is one of the magazines besides Al-Imara. Al-Imara was not unique, although it was the first. This one is by Mohamed Hamad. And thanks again to some very innovative, I would say, in terms of content, Instagram pages, for example. I was able to see that Mohamed Hamad has also published several books, for example, on European pioneers. Here you can see his 3 books on Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and Frank Lloyd Wright. And you know, so this is actually part of the challenges of the archive. Sometimes we learn about things through this kind of medium. I would have, although I do have a copy of the one in the center, I would have never seen the other 2 in a library, not at MIT, not anywhere else that I know of. And so what I'll do now is run through a sampling of the buildings. And what I will try to remember to point out here is that this is a book that's organized geographically, 17 geographic sections. There is kind of a, it's kind of difficult to try to imagine that one guidebook / survey would cover a city like Cairo, given that not much has been done in that format before. But the idea was to not reproduce the kind of hierarchies that we find in the survey elsewhere. So there are buildings like this, official and large, 1920s, courthouse, also the result of an architectural competition. And I've organized these chronologically. The book is actually organized geographically because it's designed so that you walk around the city and explore area by area. Cairo University, another big state commission from the 1920s, it takes about a decade to complete. The first Egyptian-owned bank, Bank Nassar. Kind of this mixture, for the lack of better terminology, of sort of New Islamic with Renaissance. And then you have kind of an effort to do a national style with this ancient Egyptian confection for the mausoleum of Saad Zaghloul, the national leader of 1919. Quite official, I would say, in its presentation. But then you also have smaller experimentations by architects, for example, building for themselves. And here, because it says demolished, I'm reminding myself that the book includes existing buildings, which may be in various stages of disrepair, or mostly they're not doing great, but they're also proposed buildings that were never realized, and definitely demolished buildings. And this is one of the things that I wrote about in this essay platform that I mentioned in the beginning of the talk. Yeah, it's really quite an eclectic mix. In some cases, it's quite easy to identify the architect through the images that were published. A lot of these older images come from Al-Imara, so thanks to Sayed Karim and his magazine, we're able to actually recover some of these older photographs, with a lot of photo editing so that we can have them at this quality, because usually they're printed much smaller. But for example, in this case, you can see clearly this photo was taken shortly after completion and the sign for construction is still up. And so we have for sure the name of the architect, but identification is one of the challenges for the names of architects. Dating is another challenge. And I already mentioned archival challenges. I think we should be, hopefully in the discussion, have a chance to talk more about those issues. I'll just show this example because it is the only building by Hassan Fathi, someone who Kenneth Frampton, of course, brought to international fame, who actually has very little impact on the architecture of Cairo as a city, except for this mausoleum that he built, not very much in his style at all, for a relative in 1946. And then this is another mausoleum. There was kind of a moment in which mausoleum construction was taking a kind of a shift towards grand buildings, really, to mark sort of national heroes, the national pantheon. Interesting to mention this now because actually the necropolis in Cairo is or has already lost dozens of these architecturally significant buildings and current construction for highways. And there's hundreds more planned for demolition. So this is actually part of the urgency, I think, of what I'm trying to do with this project is to try to point our attention to some of these buildings. Many, many, many more have not been documented or identified. And so this is another challenge that we should talk about. This is Mustafa Fahmi, who did the ancient Egyptian style mausoleum. He also experimented with this notion of sort of an Art Deco-y, Islamic-ish mix. I mean, you can see here the difficulty in describing these buildings using this terminology, how there's just a very clear misfit. The book also includes other types of projects like housing for workers that was done, for example, in 1950. You can see from these contemporary photographs what the original design was, but I think it's really important to be able to see the buildings in their present shape. This is actually probably out of the huge colony of housing, workers' housing. This is probably the best looking one that I was able to identify to take a picture of. So others are even much more mutated in a way. And I think that's actually kind of okay. This is a reflection of what's happening in this particular site. So actually even conventions of preservation and conservation are really challenged when you think about them from the perspective of a city like Cairo. This is Sayed Karim's house, which you've already seen. He was very savvy and conscious of sort of image and representation photography. So I'm sure the placement of the car there is not an accident. This is a photo of the interior with the spiral staircase. This is his wife and sister, photographed by himself. You can tell even from the art on the wall. This is a 3-story neon pendant that was hanging down the center. He was quite an eclectic, fascinating person. Moving on to some of his other constructions. This is a church commissioned by the Syrian Catholic community in Cairo. One of the challenges that I can now remember because of this building, despite the fact that this was down the street from where I lived, one of the ways in which the war on terror, I should put that in quotes, manifests on the neighborhood level in a place like Cairo is that I cannot visit a church down the street from where I live. There are massive walls around it, of course. Why is someone named Mohammed trying to go see a church? Suspicion, I'll probably sort of get arrested if I try. So I don't have access to the sites in many cases. We can't actually go in, even if they still exist, for those kinds of security challenges. And photography is very challenging in that kind of security state, but we can talk about that again later on. More Sayed Karim examples, some official buildings such as the Arab League, interesting to think about in relation to something like the UN some years before, the UN building. A lot of church architecture, quite interesting. Actually, here in Mexico City, a lot of the churches from the period remind me very much of the churches in Cairo from the period. So there's a reason why a city like this is actually much more relevant to look at sort of horizontally across between a place like this and Cairo, as opposed to the transit center periphery analysis, which would not really help us much in understanding a building like this. But looking at some of the art that's practicing here with what's going on in Cairo at that time might actually be much more fruitful. Typologies are also diverse. So we've already seen official buildings, workers' housing, residential, port, mausolea, hospital, hotel. The interesting note I want to say on the Walton Beckett naming here is that this hotel design was already existing before the Hilton walked into the project. Mahmoud Riyad was the designer. And it's really interesting that kind of again where the foreign, the weight and the strength and sort of ability of the foreign interlocutor to slap their name on a project that already existed so I would say I have to be sensitive about how to say this. Not everybody is a white supremacist, but white supremacy does help everybody. There is a way that we know this project is a Walton Beckett project historically by the historians, and also the fact that the architect can do this for an existing project. I'm not sure anybody would actually remember the name of Mahmoud Riyad except for some Egyptian architectural enthusiasts and his own family. More examples. Sayed Karim here having his sort of Le Corbusier moment consciously, I would say, trying to sort of be part of that image making. Some of his housing projects, quite interesting. At the time when a lot of the housing projects were built by the states across, let's say, many places were using a bar typology, he came up with this sort of broken bar with multiple entrances so that you never have to see too many apartments down a hallway. And I really think it's quite an interesting model. 5 of these towers blocks were built. I'm currently writing a chapter specifically on this housing typology for a book. And what to mention here before I actually conclude, I have a minute left, is Ramses Riza Wassef, in the sort of perspective that comes from places like New York that was trying to identify modernism as other. And this actually should bring me to my conclusion here. Other modernisms and sort of looking at what was going on in a place like Egypt by identifying Hassan Fathy as a sort of a reawakening of an Islamic architectural ethos. Someone like Ramses Riza Wassef actually kind of got the short end of the stick, even though he was doing much more interesting neo-vernacular work. Him being dropped, it didn't really fit that sort of identity-based politics. So I'm going to skip quickly through those slides. Oh, I have to show this. This is the cathedral built in '68. And in this 50-year anniversary, 2 years in 2018, it got a facelift that looked like this. I'm not in a comment, but we should just take this into consideration. So a couple of remarks in conclusion. I clearly put too many slides here. Let's talk about conservation. This is one of the buildings in the book in its current state. Again, you can read more about it in the piece on platform space. On style, there's kind of a Frankenstein inventions that come up with this idea of trying to squeeze these buildings into existing West-based sort of stylistic categories. So this building is classic and Baroque. I'm not sure exactly what that means. This is a state sign. I'm going to leave this clip. I'm going to stop here because I'm out of time, but I have a few more points that I'll bring in discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohamed, for your presentation, where you shared with the audience the snippets of your sustained work over the years that you've been doing on Cairo's modern heritage. I think perhaps we're going to allow a few more moments for our audience members to absorb all of this very rich material that you've shared with us and to formulate some questions. We've already received some, and we're still welcoming more thoughts and questions from all of you who have joined us tonight that we can bring forward to Mohamed. For now, I will leave Mohamed to discuss momentarily with Professor Nassar Rabat. As Sarah has introduced him previously, Professor Rabat is the Aga Khan Professor and the Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT. Cairo is one of his chief areas of scholarly expertise, and I'm sure he has lots of questions and thoughts to start us off tonight. Professor Rabat, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you. I don't know if I am on screen. Yeah, here I am. Well, I'll start first by saying, Mohamed, welcome back home. I hope that you will consider MIT to be one of your homes, because you had your master's degree here, and you already were interested in Cairo, but I do remember very clearly our discussions about your interest in the way Cairene were remembering a golden past, basically the period of the Art Deco and Art Nouveau architecture, either in a little bit of a revival or in the sort of like mock renewal interest in it. I will start by actually sharing with you that Sayed Karim is one of my heroes who, for many, many years, I wanted someone to write a book on him. I even admitted someone to come and do a PhD at MIT on Sayed Karim, and then he failed his TOEFL, so we couldn't get him to MIT. Having said that, your story about Sayed Karim in ETH, which I actually did not know, reminded me of my own story. I applied to ETH in 1980 to go and do my graduate studies in architecture after having finished an undergraduate professional degree in architecture at the University of Damascus that took 5.5 years. This was the time that it takes for an undergraduate degree in architecture. And ETH told me that they will recognize only 2 years, and then I will have to take 4 years of coursework in order to qualify for the graduate school. So ETH has not changed its attitude between 1933 and 1980. I don't know if they have now, but I would assume that your qualification of what we are seeing as white supremacist is actually the proper term, even though we did not use it before the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd, and that had somehow invigorated some of our rethinking about how our histories are being seen, written, projected, and so on. And that's really what I would like to talk about. First of all, I congratulate you on a wonderful book. And it's wonderful for something that you only touched upon at the end, but it seems to me that it's very, very important. But I'll start from, all of us are familiar with the subaltern and later on the postmodern, post-colonial literature. But I want to just mention Deepak Chakrabarty's unease, which somehow resonate with Frantz Fanon's earlier remark about how can we write history today when all we can do is to depend on a definition and on the structure of post-Enlightenment view of history. Yeah. Namely the idea of you have to be objective, you have to be distant, and yet you could deconstruct that. And Chakrabarty was very uneasy about that and couldn't actually figure a way to doing it. But one of the main lacuna in the ability to write in the history of the modern period, because it's the most contested period, is that we don't have the archives. And it seems to me that your book is already establishing an archive, especially for those of us who study Cairo and who realize how difficult it is to actually see all of these buildings that you have managed to bring together. Even if you had used the archives of Al-Amara of Sayed Karim, you still actually have managed to bring together a huge amount of building that would allow us to start forming a very informed idea about the modern architecture of Cairo. And I agree with you that despite the fact that I focus mostly on Mamluk Cairo, but Cairo is essentially a modern city. It needs to be studied as such and needs to be seen as such. The second point that I want to make, and also in relationship, if you want, to your book, is how your book perhaps fits the definition of Carlo Ginzburg's micro-history. Is that what you are providing in here is the kernel of something that will build a history of modernity in a modern city that is usually neglected, bring in all the actors so that we will know them, like the Sayed Karim and Hassan Fathi and the Ramses Wissa Wasif, but also the Matasheks and the Max Hertz and all of the people that have actually created that modern Cairo, and to study them on their own merit, not as part of a top-down global history, the way William Curtis, for example, has done in chapter 20 of the book that you're talking about, where he is looking at the measuring up in the rest of the world. So I feel that despite the strides in the last 30 or 40 years in the study of the modern architecture outside of the West, we still need to, first of all, build the archives, and second, to actually create a series of microhistories that will all come together in order to invigorate an approach to a global history that would be more equitable, more respectful of the traditions that are usually left out. But of course, actually, if we are going to be asked to do 4 years of studies in order to qualify, then we still have to resist that I would say blind, stubborn, and in many instances actually violent resistance of the doyen of knowledge to the possibility of a knowledge produced outside of the claim of some sort of an objectivity. So to say that history is being produced, if you want, with this idea of a distance, emotional distance, not necessarily just geographic or physical distance, but that the historian is allowed to deconstruct the subject of its study, but the historian can claim that objectivity, if you want. To me, it comes really straight in the face of the notion that we are, and this is something that you started with and I loved it, is that we are supposed to separate between the racism of the Frank Lloyd Wrights and the Corbusier of the world and their writing, and effectively also, as you started, the Hegels of our history of philosophy. Whereas if you, as an Egyptian, study modern architecture of Egypt, you're immediately accused of either being a local informant or of being an emotionally invested person, and therefore very subjective and lacking the objectivity of being able to produce a knowledge that could be shared by others. So I find that paradox, I find that actually insulting, to tell you the truth. And maybe the last point that I would say before I leave the floor to others to look at your presentation and react to it is the historian as an anthropologist notion. And this has been somewhat sort of like popular, if you want, or en vogue when I was studying architecture. Not necessarily anymore, but it was a way to correct that notion of the ability to study the others by bringing in the anthropological, if you want, field or anthropological method. I wonder if you could comment on whether you see the kind of historical work that architectural historians have to do in light of that prism that had brought anthropology and history together. Or you could actually, I mean, I offered in a sense 2 ways. The other is sort of like that microhistory construction that will move up. But of course, the aim ultimately is to reclaim a place in the telling of the history of architecture. And that will need not only to challenge history of architecture as it is being presented, but also to name the components of that history, to be able to theorize that history, to move beyond saying this is an alternative modernity or a parallel modernity, but to ultimately have the power to say that the West is such a small part of the world and cannot really continuously and fairly claim to be able to control the discourse on any history of architecture or history of anything else. But thank you a lot. This was a very thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you very much, Nassar. This is very generous of you. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Abat. Mohamed, I don't know if you want to respond to some of the things that Professor Abat has brought up, or if you want me to start sharing with you some of the audience questions.
Maybe just I'll do it like super bullet point brief because I feel like quite a lot of important points. I mean, thank you, Nassar, again for your generous observations and comments. And I would just want to, like, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've been called a nationalist because I'm doing this kind of work. And anybody who knows me certainly knows I'm not. And the fact that I have to defend myself and it becomes very personal, this kind of, you know, it actually really gets in the way. Well, if I was a nationalist, I would be home right now. I wouldn't be in Mexico City. Let's just say that. The idea of sort of the archives, but also related to that, alternative archives, microhistories, historian as anthropologists, I think working beyond the scope of the West, such as you know, the introduction of the lens of race, for example. I mean, the new volume on race and the history of modern architecture. In the discussions around that book, I was just watching a beautiful kind of GSAP event that was done on the book. I guess it was last year. Sort of the notion of oral histories came up, but also, you know, gossip. Because, you know, one of the challenges I faced with the book is a lot of it can be hearsay. You know, so and so. If we can't access the building, if the building no longer exists, if we can't identify the architect, there's a lot of hearsay that then crowds your space, and you try to figure out how to deal with it. And so we don't have really the methods to know what to do with that kind of material. So far, we're being trained to say none of that matters. People can say whatever they want. It doesn't exist. But sometimes that's all we have. So I think there are new challenges like this with working on these kinds of spaces that might have to force us in a way to actually discard our conventions that are based on places where you have an entire archive of an architect sitting at the Getty or at MoMA, or this is really the exception. This is not what the world of architecture looks like. And definitely to look at the buildings on their own merits. One of the things, and the architects, one of the things I was trying to do with the book is really to be very, you know, factual in a way. You know, here is a building, this is where it is, this is what it does, this is what it looks like, this is what we know about it, and then move on to the next without superimposing a sort of a stylistic lens or compare it to something else. This is not, I think, the most interesting approach. And one thing that I never mentioned, the guidebook as a format, in this context is really kind of a statement. I would say it's a political statement even, given that people are not supposed to walk around, take pictures, but it's actually, more importantly, a book for people. It's not, this is not architectural history for architectural historians, which I think a lot of the field is really shaped by. Yeah, one last point. I think what we're really trying to do here is, you know, without naming names, but I was watching a talk at CAA, Canadian Center, CCA, Canadian Center for Architecture, about global history, and I was kind of dumbfounded by the ease with which the speaker was saying, you know, you need to send students to draw plans in sections. And I'm thinking to myself, those are mostly international students who are flying to the ivory tower in order to gain legitimacy for what they do. And then, you know, they're paying for visas and travel expenses. And then we're supposed to wait until we get to the ivory tower to be sent back out to the field to draw plans in sections. A lot of these buildings are not going to wait. And actually the response is not to maintain the primacy or the supremacy, even to use that term, of the ivory tower, but actually to do the sacrifices that might entail building institutions where they need to be, so that the knowledge is actually produced locally. The uneven development of the world is completely paralleled by the uneven distribution of the institutions that actually write our history. They're clustered in very specific places. They maintain to be supreme in what they do, and without actually talking about the bigger political challenges that the world is facing, part of which the question of race and white supremacy, then local institutions are not going to pop up in all over the place to write those histories. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Great. We have lots of audience questions and many congratulations. Professor Sybil Bostergan is congratulating you for the fabulous work you've done. I wanted to start with a question that I had mixed in with a question from Professor Hegnar Wattenpaul. She said, "Thank you so much, Mohamed, for this fantastic presentation. Your images featured women working on architectural projects. Can you tell us more about them?" And I wanted to add to that, because aside from Shahira Fahmi and Zaha Hadid, I saw very few women names in the roster of architects featured in the book. And I saw them appear more in commissioner roles. Such as the amazing waqf of Asma Hanem Halim's vocational school mixed with an elderly home, this kind of fantastic programmatic hybrid. So I'm curious as well about the role of women in the development of the architectural vocabulary of Cairo over the past 100 years. Whether as architects or as commissioners or as writers, and how might a feminist approach to designing the housing, for example, how could it have informed the designs that were ultimately built?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. This is something that was really important for me to I anticipated this question, let's say, when I was writing the book. So it was important for me to at least have a thought about it, because the material out there was very very little on sort of the presence of women as architects practicing at this time. But I did continue to find anecdotes, such as the fact that Al-Imara magazine, for example, in its later years, the main patron was Sayed Karim's wife. When his father died, his wife was actually the patron of the magazine, paying for it. And I thought, okay, so this is interesting. Let me look deeper in that direction. And you know, while that particular image that featured in the very beginning of the book shows a woman architect sort of building that model of the exhibition grounds, I found very little material naming women, but clearly they existed. I mean, that was an image in a lifestyle magazine that was not an architecture magazine, and that ended up there. Of course, nobody was named. So people, you know, not everybody published, as what was one of the points I want to say about that, is there could have been female women practitioners at the time, 1940s and onwards, because we know that by the late 40s, we have women in the School of Architecture in Cairo University. So they must have graduated and they must have done something. But not everybody published. So actually what we're looking at is material that's already represented a very small section, even of, let's say, the men who practiced. So if not everybody published, you can imagine that women were perhaps less likely to publish their work in that particular format, at least in that particular magazine. So there's the kind of like idea of, if we don't see it, does that mean it doesn't exist? Or does it mean we just haven't found the evidence? So I just want to put that out there. But as you pointed, Manar, the question of patronage, as I saw with Duraya Lotfi being the patron of the magazine, many buildings in the book were commissioned by women, which is actually already quite interesting to think about gender in that sort of boss role as opposed to the practitioner role. And I tried to mention this when I know that information. And in some cases, that's evident from the name of the building, as many of the buildings were named after their patrons. So you'll start to see actually a lot of women's names listed. And that particular case of the Asma, the Waqf, it's a really totally feminist project. I mean, it includes, it's commissioned by a woman. It is a school for children who are in need of education, 50, but it's also shelter for 50 elderly women. But it's also, and this is the most interesting component, it also has a safe house for women who want to leave domestic disputes. This is done in 1958. Really interesting. And this is published in Al-Imara, which is why we know those kinds of details. So I think there's a lot more work to be done. But yes, you're right. Really, it's Shahira and Zaha Hadid with an unrealized project that are actually included in the book, based on what's available.
Actually, I wanted to follow up on what Professor Rabat brought up about your archival research. And I think there's also an audience question about how to react to the from Pedro, how do we react to the difficulties and gaps in archival material due to inaccessibility or colonial erasure in Egypt's museums and archives? Is art the answer? And I also want to add to that, I was curious about your process in sort of assembling this archive. Aside from where possible, you visited the architect's archive in their family home or in the archive at the AUC library, or you followed trails from Al Imara magazine. But what other kind of methods did you did you go on walks and try to conduct interviews to find out more about the buildings where a plan wasn't available, or a section? You took photographs, but then how did you determine like how the building worked? I'm just very curious about your process, and also about your editorial decisions, like what made the cut, the final cut in the book, like what was left out and why, and how did you make your decisions?
Thank you. Those are two separate questions. I'll try to be quick on them. I think I said that the last time and I wasn't quick, so let's see.
No, you've been great.
So first of all, this is a great time to thank again the big team of volunteers. That this is a book that took 5 years in the background of whatever else I was doing, and in that time there was a team of volunteers that really started with 1, and its biggest was 20, and managed by the really incredible Hala Hijazi, who is currently based in Berlin. And I think just to say, in the context of everything that I've been saying today, it is not easy to be a woman of color architect in Berlin until today. So kudos to Hala for managing this project and handling the team. So the team did multiple things. There was scouting. I mean, I wanted in essence to do to start on 2 parallel paths. One is to collect everything that we can find that already exists out there. And like I showed, Mohamed Hamed, for example, who did the magazine, the one with the rainbow hand, and several others, he published books. And there are others, a couple of attempts really to construct a survey, let's say, but they didn't call it a survey, but essentially what could be called surveys. So Egypt Builds was done by him in 1963, and then there's another book in 1989. So to collect that material, all the magazines that we can find, and then to scout into other magazine types that are not aimed at architecture. I was building my own collection of magazines, which is actually how I wrote my dissertation. In the absence of an archive, it became a dissertation about the images and this circulation of images and discourses around the architecture in the city, because magazines are what's available. So that was kind of an alternative approach to confronting a problem of not having access to actual archives. So that was one front. The other front was to start completely from scratch, as if we have nothing, and to scout the city. And the teams of volunteers really divided the map into different sections, and they went and explored. When they had off time, they had many adventures. They were chased by police. They were chased by webs. The photographers the same, and so it was not an easy process. It's really not easy to do. I really cannot underplay this. It's not easy to do research in certain geographies. I mean, I was just thinking when I was preparing for today's talk, how can we write a global history of architecture when Yemen is being bombed, when Sudan, nobody knows what's going on, when Libya, nobody knows, what kind of global architecture are we pretending we can write? And even in places that are supposedly not being bombed to the ground, you have, security states that are quite heavy-handed that will chase 20-somethings because they have a camera walking down the street in their own city. And this is part of the reality. Right in the middle of a really kind of intense personal crisis that involved racism in recent months, I got a message from someone saying, "Are you still able to meet the deadline? I'm sorry for what happened to you. Are you still able to meet the deadline?" And I'm just pointing this out to say that time does not work equally for all of us. I'm very, I'm very sorry to be blunt. Doing research in that kind of context, in those kinds of places, confronting those kinds of challenges. When James Baldwin was asked why he takes so long between books, he said, well, I have to dodge assassinations, So I'm just pointing these kinds of things out to say that, a book like this could have been done in other contexts in maybe a year. But these kinds of challenges, the scouting alone and the dangers that can come with it, are assembling an archive in the non-existence of archives because of really violent colonial and, well, still colonial, even if it's nationalist histories, because it operates really using the same way, burning libraries and confiscating contents of offices and shutting down institutions and so on. These are things that are actually happening that make this research difficult. So scouting, collecting every bit and piece that we can find, and then try to sort out through it. Initially, we built a list of about 600 buildings.
Wow.
Out of which and what was really important for me is actually, in a way, I'd like to think of it as a participatory project, because a lot of those volunteers were actually coming up with buildings that I would have never. This is not Mohamed Elshahed's Cairo, Mohamed Elshahed. This is also everybody else who worked on the book, and to be okay that we may not know the name of the architect. I don't want to be so committed to that sort of Western art history where the architect must be sort of named. A lot of the cases we will never know, and that doesn't mean that it should not be remembered, documented, photographed, and included. So you will notice that in the book, there's a lot of buildings where it says unknown. In other cases, we have to come up with the best guess based on available information, connecting the dots in many ways. So I think I'll stop there, but I think I responded to.
Yeah, that was great. We have a bunch of other questions. So, because we're kind of reaching the end of our time almost, but I'm going to read out several questions, and then if you can try to address them. So to follow up actually on this archival and heritage issue, Rose is asking, have you engaged with heritage professionals to try to protect and preserve these buildings? And then we have Dr. Huma Gupta, who says, thank you for this wonderful talk. Her question is about Sayed Karim. She's asking, can you speak a bit more about Sayed Karim's work in other cities in the region, specifically his 1947 proposal for the New Baghdad? Sarah wanted to ask, you've emphasized the importance of decoloniality in architectural education, especially in the United States. Emmanuel Adamasu from the Black Reconstruction Collective has recently suggested that a shift from speaking of architecture with a capital A to spatiality. What are your thoughts on this, especially when thinking of a pedagogical framework? And then finally, we have several comments and questions that are interested in the contemporary urban phenomena of Cairo and its future planning. Some of the questions are asking, to what extent is it possible to imagine the urban planning and management of Cairo, especially as it is a vast, unruly, layered, and historically complex city? Do you have thoughts on architectural visions of the future while avoiding the plague of a Dubai style and avoiding the traps of nostalgia? How would you describe the architectural style of the new admin capital, and where did it come from? So,
I don't know the answer to that one. It's not very pleasant, unfortunately.
So you can pick and choose. I think we have like probably 5 more minutes. What you might be able to address in these final.
I'll do kind of like a fire back type of.
Okay.
Okay, so can we protect some of these buildings? It's really important. I wrote something. Actually, the piece that's in platform space touches specifically on this issue, because the reason that demolitions are so widespread, both by the state and by private owners, and there's really a predatory kind of real estate market that nobody really quite has studied it thoroughly yet, that is eating up the fabric of the city. There's far more housing, and maybe the recent book also by AUC Press on the housing crisis sorry, just look it up, would be useful to understand that wider context. There's no need for anything to be demolished. There's enough housing to house everyone. This is not what it's about, right? It's about something else. So the reason to say all of this is to protect any of this, you need to have a foundation, a legal foundation. And of course, we're talking about a place where the law is not really necessarily made, not to really protect private property nor individuals. This is why really just coming to terms with the, when I immigrated to the United States in 1995, I was coming, and I didn't realize it then, but I was essentially coming home to the heart of my empire, kind of like when Indians and Caribbeans were going to London in the 1940s and 50s. And I think we really need to grapple with the present coloniality of the places that we're talking about, because it really, putting up the question about the law, why doesn't the law do this and that? I think we're kind of missing a lot of the picture. So I'll just say that. Contemporary architecture, one of the reasons, and I say this in the introduction, students in Egypt can graduate from architecture school without taking a survey course in Egyptian modern architecture. And so imagine going to architecture school at MIT and going through the whole degree without taking architectural history. I mean, impossible, right? I mean, as students, we flip through magazines, we look at history and we piece things together, and we sort of, I want to reject this, I want to copy this, I want to, respond to this. You have to have something to interact with as you formulate your own architectural ideas. So there's a complete vacuum. And so you cannot have really a thriving contemporary architectural culture when it's cut off from what had just been built a couple of generations ago. I think this is really kind of a crime for the profession. And this is also what Sayed Karim was responding to. So Karim, Baghdad, 1947, what's really interesting is part of that push post-World War II to think of Arab architects thinking of themselves as really initiators, not just people who fulfill the demands of the state, but actually initiators of projects to improve the life of the wider population of the region. Sort of this optimism that came with the end of World War II was to come up with projects that nobody actually asked for. So the new Baghdad project, the new Damascus project, he did projects for Haifa and so on. Many of these were actually him, not actually without permission, sitting in his office, coming up with plans, hoping that they will be picked up someday. So I think it's just important to also give that context. I missed a couple, but I think I hit a few of the questions.
There was one about pedagogy and decoloniality in architectural education.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, so much for that question. I mean, I do think that notions of spatiality really need to be pushed to the forefront. This is why I sort of treat the city and then the neighborhood, and I try to even organize the buildings in a way that takes into consideration the fact that these are not isolated arts of, works of art. And I think the way we're taught architectural history, because it tries in the survey to sort of include everything, supposedly, you end up with these sort of iconic buildings that are scattered all throughout the map. There's no really sense of their place in the world, in a way. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say? They're not really... Yeah. They're not put in their place. And so I think you lose it, and the focus becomes on the architect, how genius he was, and wow. And we don't even think about the histories that might have produced these buildings, many of which are actually colonial histories and wealth that came from those kind of colonial endeavors. We don't think about any of this. So there's decontextualization happening, which is essentially what we do with museums when we take objects out of context and suddenly, they're beautiful in their display cases in London, but we all know it didn't come from London. And so the architectural history version of this is to pluck buildings and to plug them into the survey in this kind of very loose. So the response to all of this is to be very space conscious, to actually look at spatiality with all of its complexity, with the multiple manifestations that might include anonymous. This is why I say anonymous architecture should be considered. This is why there are buildings that we don't know who did it. And they might be considered from the lens of, someone who's trying to look for architecture with a capital A as insignificant. And actually this is a good place to remember that Persevere's books, guidebooks for England, actually tried to do this. He did 47 volumes or something like this. where there were guidebooks, so they're aimed at the general public. And this was actually really important for the movement of preservation in England. And it looked at everything. He didn't only choose masterworks. He really walked down street by street, town by town, and said, here's this, here's that, and here's this. And so you get this kind of spatial sequencing. And that allowed a mainstream knowledge of space, including as many manifestations, architectural manifestations, that also became sort of a backbone for a preservation movement. So yes, it is a decolonial thing for us to do that in our context, but in a way that's actually what the discipline tried to do in the heart of the metropole, I would say. But we're sort of been denied that, maybe. Yeah.
And thank you for that. And then maybe as a last sort of question, the question on the future. What kind of I mean, how do you see the architectural visions of the future while avoiding this Dubai style and the traps of nostalgia?
Yeah, a couple of things here. I think the future has been weaponized as a way to not really be in the present. And the present has been, in some contexts at least, and I'm thinking about Cairo here when I'm saying this, you know, a lot of very destructive things have been happening in Cairo that actually kind of ruined it in many ways, on the promise of a better future that actually never materializes. And I think we really need to just be very careful about what future are we talking about, because the future has been weaponized in so many contexts in ways that allows violent unmaking of places in the present, and that future never manifests. So I'm personally not really I'm in the business of sort of envisioning futures, because I think without really being able to have a grasp on the present, and especially actually its relationship with the recent past, it's really difficult to have anything beyond schematic for the future. And, you know, part of that is actually grappling with the very serious political realities that we're living, that are actually networked, they're connected. You know, the surveillance that's used in Cairo is brought from China with its Israeli design, and it's a US whatever funding that paid for it. You know, there is a network kind of reality that we live in. You know, American offices based in New York, in order to survive and be able to pay their New York rent, they have to open offices in Dubai and then hire underpaid workers to carry out most of their work. You know what I mean? These are very networked realities that are tied to our politics and economies. And I think if we're serious about thinking about the future, let's understand what this is in the present, and try to actually confront it. I mean, I don't know if this is like call for revolution or protest or whatever you want to call it, but like, it's time to flip the table. I ended on that slide with James Baldwin saying the party is over. He said that, you know, in the 70s, but I think that's what we need to actually remind ourselves today.
Well, thank you so much for this very rich and satisfying talk and discussion. I've always kind of admired the energy and the kind of commitment that you have, both as a scholar and as a public. You take on these sort of two roles: public intellectual with your blog, with your Instagram. You're trying to challenge through the kind of ways that you disseminate the knowledge that you've acquired, the specialized knowledge you've acquired in your education, to a wider and broader public. And so thank you so much for all the work that you've been doing, and for generously sharing everything with us tonight. And thanks to Sarah for being behind the scenes with the questions, to Hossein Luis, to Amanda, the tech support, and to Professor Rabat, of course, for inviting you tonight to share this with us. Thanks to everyone in the audience for coming this evening. We hope you will join the department for our next event on Thursday, March 11th at 6 p.m. for a lecture hosted with the Building Technology Program, Joy Within by Christiana Moss of Studio MA. I also want to remind everyone of the upcoming Aga Khan lecture on April 12th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The title of the lecture is Lived Heritage and the Sacred Topography of Harar Jugol, Ethiopia, by Professor Michelle Moore Apostos from the Department of Art at Williams College. You can also see the full list of upcoming events at architecture.mit.edu. We hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much, Mohamed, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for watching.